What's up? It's Andrew from the band Ripped to Shreds. Today I'm going to explain to you how you've been lied to for years. Because old school death metal isn't real. In 1981, French philosopher Jean Baudrillard published Simulacra and Simulation, a philosophical treatise on semiotics, the philosophy of signs. He postulated that signs, which we use to talk about things, no longer have any origin or relation to consensus reality at all, and that those signs have actually subsumed the original concept and thus become everyone's reality.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
Old school death metal, as we talk about it today, is a simulation. The 90s brought an explosion of death metal subgenres, from progressive to technical to brutal, or even melodic. Today, the common usage of the phrase old school death metal refers to any band that can't be neatly described in these subgenres. Marketing copy from underground labels stridently reference the old days, the archaic or vintage or putrid and rotting. But none of these modern bands actually sound anything like bands that could have come from the dawn of death metal. And more importantly, there wasn't a single unified old school sound for modern bands to imitate anyways. Returning to Baudrillard's theory of simulacra, death metal exists in the hyperreal, where old school death metal is a sign divorced from any referential meaning, rather than a signifier of music that could have come from the 80s or even the early 90s. It is a symbol of rejection to so-called poser trends like breakdowns or melody or drum samples, and a symbol of fetishism for physical media like cassette tapes or vinyl. The function of those objects aren't relevant. And old school death metal doesn't dub tapes because it's the cheapest way to send music to your pen pal from another country. OSDM does it because that's how you perform being old school. And the reality is gone because old school bands of the time were not performing old school death metal. They were performing new, rebellious youth music. The actual era of mid-80s bands is irrevocably fixed in the past. And the simulacra promises an idealized authenticity as marketing copy for today's commodified music. Production is one of the first things that bands and critics reach for when they're assessing whether or not something is old school. Common buzzwords that have been used over the last 15 years include murky, cavernous, open, raw, buzzsaw, and this is in opposition to modern death metal, which is clean, compressed, overproduced, surgical, edited. Typically, bands and albums that are referenced, like Cannibal Corpse or Dismember, are from between 1990 and 1995, which I think can actually be considered a second wave of death metal. There's an obsession with not using any drum triggers or any editing of drum performances to be true to the old ways. But if you measure the old ways by the classic Morrisound period of the early 90s, drum triggers and performance editing were already standard. According to an interview with producer Scott Burns, drummers back then were usually so unprepared that he would mute blast beat sections, ask the drummer how many kick and snare hits there were supposed to be, and individually program in every single hit. Beat Detective and Elastic Audio might not have existed until 2001, but the same thing was being done manually on those late 80s and early 90s records. A common criticism of those 90s Florida death metal records from old heads of the time were that they sounded too polished or too perfect. The exact same criticism levied by modern metalheads at bands like Archspire or Cattle Decapitation. It's ironic that our modern conception of unpolished production is an idealization of what metalheads considered to be overproduced in the 90s. Quick word from your sponsor, who is me. My old school, period correct hair metal band, Heavy Metal Shrapnel, featuring Mark Bowles, will be playing live at the Soldiers of Steel Festival in August. It's in Washington. It's a whole bunch of absolutely sick traditional metal bands. We got like Sanctuary, Sacred Blade is coming down from Canada for the first time in like 40 years. You got like Saint, we have Accused, we have a couple more cool co-headliners that haven't been announced yet. So check out the link in the description for tickets and all that good shit. Thanks. So here are two aspects of old school death metal production that objectively have no basis in any 80s or 90s records. The first one is huge kick drums, and the second is massively reverbed vocals. modern kick drums, not just in rock music, but across all popular music nowadays, is extremely subby. There's an incredible amount of low-end information in those kicks. 80s rock production across the board is characterized by thin bass and piercing highs. There's a lot of misinformation about how vinyl records can't be pressed with too much bass, or that everyone was high on cocaine and they couldn't hear any highs without maxing out the faders. And that's why records produced for vinyl back then were all light and bass. The real answer is much simpler. It wasn't the style for rock production to have big bass. Early 80s hip-hop, like Africa Bambaataa, were already using the Roland 808 drum machine, which has a hilariously subby kick. Of course, now we have modern techniques of saturating the bass and synthesizing higher harmonics to increase the apparent bass level. That's just a different way of processing the bass. What's clear is that although the technology was there, extreme metal producers simply chose not to use it. Kicks were very thin and mixed very low. And then that early trend was followed by the era of clicky typewriter kicks, like Decapitated or Dying Fetus, up to the Faceless. I personally started to notice fatter and subbier kicks in metal music towards the tail end of the 2000s. I think it's extremely difficult for a modern musician who grew up with modern sounds to put aside all their aesthetic trends to pursue a different aesthetic. For example, if my clients ask me for an old school mix, I know that if I gave them an actually period correct mix with the right amount of bass in the kick as like 7 churches, they'll ask me to make the mix punchier and fatter because they expect the kick to be huge. So going back to Baudrillard, old school death metal here is signifying a self-referential aesthetic, one that demands huge kick drums and are unrelated to the period accurate tastes. Then we have caverncore of the early 2010s that, supposedly mimicked incantation. And then the later caveman death metal trend was also lumped in together under retro old school death metal. And that sound was typically achieved with a huge amount of reverb on the vocals. Incredibly long reverb tails with a lot of delay. And yet when we look back at those early incantation records, what do we actually hear? On Golgotha and Nazarene, certainly there is reverb on the vocals, but it's not nearly as exaggerated as modern records. If we want to look for this kind of vocal processing in other records from the 90s, we find that most of them are very dry. Cyanide's Dying Truth does have a pretty pronounced effect, but it's like a very short tail on a plate reverb. And Autopsy's Mental Funeral, again, it does have audible reverb, but it's a very short tail. It doesn't take over and hang on top of the entire mix. I think a very interesting example here is Spectral Voice, because their Necrotic Doom demo is basically cloning Ripikolu's Musta Ceremonia musically. The vocals on the Ripikolu demo are actually extremely dry and mixed up front, which is completely unlike Necrotic Doom, where the vocals are buried deep in a ton of reverb and sat way back. So Cavernous vocals do have a basis in reality. That is, audible vocal reverb was in truth used in a select number of 90s releases, but the modern usage of it is exaggerated tenfold. And yet, when a modern listener hears that reverb on the vocals, they instantly think, oh, that's old school death metal. Again, the simulacra of old school death metal has replaced the reality of 80s and 90s records. According to Marx, commodities possess four major types of value: use value, economic value, price, and exchange value. Use value is what you use an object for. Water is drinkable and satisfies thirst. Economic value is the maximum amount of money that a person is willing to pay for an object. And the price is the current amount of money a person could purchase said object for. Exchange value describes how you can trade one commodity for another. It's also important to note that the exchange value of commodity is often misaligned with its use value. Imagine trading water for diamonds. You would need a huge quantity of water, which has an extremely important use value to humans, for a tiny amount of diamonds, which has a low use value. Baudrillard theorized of yet another type of value: sign value. In our late capitalist society, commodities gain value by the status or social differentiation they confer. A plain white Supreme tea has sign value because it shows you have fashion sense and money to spend on it. Old school death metal, as a concept, has sign value in showing that you're not a poser, or you have good musical taste, and you don't play overproduced tech prog. If you listen to this band, you're listening to old bands. If you write this riff, you're writing the music of old bands. If you use just this one weird production trick, you sound the same as old bands. The simulation moves further and further away from the real music, both in the here and now and the historical. Other ways of performing old school death metal manifests in merch. The current market reality is that the exchange value of recorded music is functionally zero. A song is available to listen for free anywhere in the world, and you can't give that recorded song to someone and receive some good in return. Yet, we have a booming metal economy in tapes, CDs, and vinyl. The use value of those physical media 40 years ago was to listen to music. Tapes were great because they were an extremely cheap way for anyone to record and mail music thousands of miles. But today, you can email an MP3 for no money at all. Most cars don't even come with CD players, much less cassette players. And studies show that half of vinyl purchasers don't even own a turntable. For the majority of consumers, it's not the use value that they buy physical media for. It's the sign value. 80s and 90s metalheads bought CD and vinyl and recorded tapes. So by ritualistically doing the same actions 40 years later, we are also performing old school death metal. And of course, that's not a value judgment about said rituals. I call my own music OSDM because that's how I'll reach people who would be interested in hearing it. I ritualistically purchase and sell records to engage with and participate in the underground community. Doing so just addresses a different function from the historical function. There's a huge amount of modern bands labeled old school death metal, and it would be impossible to exhaustively address every single band and the bands that they supposedly copy. So I'm gonna cherry pick one that I think posits interesting questions. Take Frozen Soul. Crypt of Ice is very obviously aping Bolt Thrower. And Bolt Thrower has been around since 1986. So that makes Bolt Thrower old school death metal, right? And through the transitive property, Frozen Soul must also be old school death metal. I think the most interesting question here is Bolt Thrower actually old school death metal? You can clearly identify three, arguably four, extremely distinct sounds that they played throughout their career. On In Battle There Is No Law, Bolt Thrower is playing a crust-influenced death metal, focused on Cannibal Corpse-style blast, with one snare hit for every 2 kick drum hits over double bass, and the riffs are heavily indebted to UK crust legend Sacrilege. In '89, they changed styles on Realms of Chaos. Now they play suffocation blast beats with the snare on every single kick hit. There's more epic melodic riffs that would eventually become their hallmark. The crusty grindcore riffs are still there, but they're changing quite a bit. War Master is a slow evolution from Realm of Chaos, with a lot less blast beats, but they're still there, and more tremolo riffs. And this type of riff isn't being used anymore. Then on Fourth Crusade in 1992, that's where they really turn into the stereotypical all tremolo riff, all mid-pace double bass Bolt Thrower that people think of when they think of the band. And then I would personally argue there's actually a third style change when Andy Whale leaves the band and Martin Kearns comes in on the drum throne. Because on Mercenary Forwards, the tempos slow way down. The double bass becomes a lot less frantic. There's very little of Andy's trademark snare, 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 tom-tom-tom, snare, 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 tom-tom-tom fills. The snare on the double bass sections are on every single downbeat, rather than on the 2 and the 4, or even on the upbeat of every measure. And this is what I kind of call their new metal era. So which of these could be considered old school? Every era sounds like a different band. In Battle, There's No Law and Realms of Chaos has a relatively murky and lo-fi production. And from War Master onwards, every subsequent release gets more and more clear. War Master also coexisted with a vast array of death metal that sounds totally alien to each other. Brutal death was being invented by suffocation and internal bleeding and pyrexia. Tech death, although it's pretty different from what it would become in the early 2000s with all the sweeping, was already mature with Atheist and Cynic, Pestilence and Cryptopsy, and there was even Death and Roll with Zizma's debut and Entombed's Wolverine Blues. What's most compelling to me is the idea that only the first two Bolt Thrower records are old school death metal, as it comes from the same primordial mass of extreme metal practiced by Celtic Frost, or Possessed, Slayer, Sepultura, Master, Morbid Angel, and Repulsion. Those bands actually had a somewhat unified sound, with the thrashy palm muted tremolo riffing and the toompa toompa beats. And along the same lines, I don't think simple or caveman riffing is necessarily characteristic of the 90s either. Certainly Mortician had a spectacularly boneheaded style, but spidery riffing of bands like Hellwitch or Immolation or Demilich existed at the same time. And even earlier, in the late 80s, Carcass was already playing strange and eclectic riffs on Symphonies of Sickness. If my contention is that there is no singular historical old school, what does that mean for modern bands? I think it's just modern death metal. No frills, lo-fi, simple death metal can coexist alongside overproduced technical proggy bands, the same way that those same types of bands coexisted in the 90s. And perhaps that's the singular point, where the simulacra of old school death metal has a direct parallel with a genuine old school and penetrates through the veil of hyperreality. That's pretty much all I have for today. Don't forget, my hair metal band, Heavy Metal Shrapnel, playing old school hair metal, period correct old school hair metal, is playing the Soldiers of Steel Fest in August at Seattle. Headliners are Sanctuary, some other cool bands that haven't been announced yet. If you're watching this a bit later, there's a new Heavy Metal Shrapnel single out right now. Check it out. And as always, eat ass, blast fast, and peace.